one of the main characters in Philip K. Dick's novel, The Man in the High Castle, who we're introduced to in the very first chapter in a very packed scene, is Frink. And there's a lot of important sub-themes that are all connected together in this very first vignette, telling us who this guy actually is. So we begin with a crisis that has been imposed on him. He's been fired from his job where, as we're going to learn, he creates fake Civil War pistols, all sorts of other things. So we find out that he had done wrong at the factory, spouted the wrong kind of talk to Mr. Wyndham Matson, who had a dished-in face with a Socrates-type nose, a power, a throne. Frank's thoughts wandered groggily. Yes, he thought, and now they'll blacklist me. My skill is of no use. I have no trade. 15 years experience gone. Now, 15 years experience doing what? Generating fakes, which are sold in the antiquities markets in the Pacific states of America. And there's this entire thing that he's going to have to do. He's going to have to appear at the Laborers' Justification Commission for revision of his work category. His former boss, Wyndham Matson, has a lot of power there. And if he fails to succeed in pleading his case, then what is he going to do? Can he stay in the Pacific states of America? Perhaps not. He could go into the Rocky Mountain states, but they could extradite him as well. He can't go to the South, and he certainly can't go to the Nazi United States of America. Why? Because he's a Jew. So we find out his original name was Frank Fink. He had been born on the East Coast in New York. In 1941, he'd been drafted into the Army of the United States of America. Right after the collapse of Russia, after the Japs had taken Hawaii, he'd been sent to the West Coast. When the war ended, there he was on the Japanese side of the settlement line, and there he was today, 15 years later. And this is actually very fortunate for him, because if he was on the other side, he would have long ago been executed as a Jew. So he's able to live as a essentially secular Jew, not particularly religious. The only real religion that he has is consulting the I Ching and some sort of speculations about connections to his ex-wife. So he's living in the Pacific states of America, and we find out that his attitude has changed. In 1947, on Capitulation Day, he'd gone more or less berserk. Hating the Japanese as he did, he had vowed revenge. He buried his service weapons 10 feet underground in a basement, well wrapped and oiled. For the day, he and his buddies arose, and then we read, however, time is the great healer, a fact he had not taken into account. And he's accommodated himself in part because he sees that, although, he's not at the top of the racial hierarchy, obviously the Japanese things are actually fairly well run on the whole in the Pacific states of America by comparison to the Nazi-held territories. And, he talks about the rugged stoic honesty of the trade missions, right? And he says, I guess I really have faith in this co-prosperity Pacific Alliance stuff, he said to himself. Strange. Looking back to the early days, it had seemed such an obvious fake then, empty propaganda, but now, and then he starts listening to a broadcast on the radio. And he's got some reflections that are in there about what the Nazis did and where the Japanese are vis-a-vis the German Reich. And then he starts consulting the Oracle, the I Ching, the Book of Changes, which he does at a number of different points within this narrative. It's something quite important for him. And he asks two important questions. So one of these goes back to his crisis. How should I approach Wyndham Matson in order to come to decent terms with him? And he gets an answer to that. Then he asks another question, which brings up another key theme. He sets himself a new question. Will I ever see Juliana again? And Juliana is his wife, or rather his ex-wife. And so we should move on to that. That's another really absolutely central theme for this guy. So in this part of chapter 1, we read here that she had divorced him a year ago. He had not seen her in months. In fact, he didn't even know where she lived. Evidently, she'd left San Francisco, perhaps even the Pacific states of America. Either their mutual friends had not heard from her, or they were not telling him. And so there's some reflection here about the I Ching, and he gets a hexagram coming to meet, and he thinks, oh man, so she was wrong for me. I know that. I didn't ask that. Why does the oracle have to remind me? A bad fate for me to have met her and been in love, be in love with her. And there's some interesting reflections here about what is going on with her. There's some description that we'll probably just skip over here. But what's the important parts for Frink? He's in love with her. He fell in love with her. He stays in love with her. Even toward the end, when they'd been fighting so much, he never saw her as anything but a direct, literal invention of God's, dropped into his life for reasons he would never know. And then here's where it gets really interesting. And on that account, a sort of religious intuition or faith about her, he could never get over having lost her. So even though a year has passed, he can't move on from the breakup, in part because they are connected. And the next paragraph, she seemed so close right now as if he still had her, that spirit still busy in his life, padding through his room in search of whatever it was that Juliana sought, and in his mind whenever he took up the volumes of the oracle. So in a certain way, the I Ching is something that connects them. And we do find out later that Juliana consults it and, in fact, has some pretty important insights. And Frink was the one who got her into that practice in the first place. There's one other really important chapter for the relationship between the two of them. And this is after he has formed the Ed Frank Jewelry Company, and they've actually got a nice stock of things, and they're going in to try to sell it to Robert Childen. And what we learn is that he is going to have all sorts of reflections about Juliana. But first it begins with thinking about sending her some jewelry. So he's thinking, if Juliana was here, she could stroll in there and do it, that is, sell the stuff without batting an eye. She's pretty, she can talk to anybody on earth, and she's a woman. This is women's jewelry. She could wear it into the store. Shutting his eyes, he tried to imagine how she would look with one of their bracelets on, or one of their large silver necklaces, with her black hair and her pale skin, doleful, probing eyes, wearing a gray jersey sweater a bit too tight, the silver resting against her bare flesh, metal rising and falling as she breathed. God, she was vivid in his mind right now. Every piece they made, the strong, thin fingers picked up, examined, tossing her head back, holding the piece high. Juliana sorting, always a witness to what he had done. And he starts thinking about, well, what pieces would I send her? Best would be earrings, And then he thinks about other things that they could send to her. And he says, I'll send her some jewelry. And he in fact asks his friend Ed, who he's in on this with, can we send some to her? And Ed says, I didn't know you were married. And he's, well, I'm going to send it to my ex-wife. So the jewelry becomes an interesting connection, a reconnection back to her, and a way that he could possibly win her back. And now we get some really interesting reflections. He says, I know she's living with some guy, sleeping with him, as if she was his wife. I know Juliana. She couldn't survive any other way. I know how she gets around nightfall when it gets cold and dark and everybody's home sitting around the living room. She was never made for a solitary life. Me neither, he realized. And then he thinks about who she could be with. Maybe the guy's a real nice guy, some shy student she picked up. She'd be a good woman for some young guy who never had the courage to approach a woman before. She's not hard or cynical. It would do him a lot of good. I hope to hell she's not with some older guy. That's what I couldn't stand. Some experienced mean guy with a toothpick sticking out of the side of his mouth, pushing her around. He felt himself beginning to breathe heavily. Image of some beefy, hairy guy stepping down hard on Juliana, making her life miserable. I know she'd finally wind up killing herself, he thought. It's in the cards for her if she doesn't find the right man. And that means a really gentle, sensitive, kindly student type who would be able to appreciate all those thoughts she has. So he's wavering between two pictures of what could be going on. The one, an older, brutish guy, and then the kindly, nice, shy student. And then he thinks about himself. I was too rough for her, he thought. And I'm not so bad. There are a hell of a lot of guys worse than me. I could pretty well figure out what she was thinking, what she wanted when she felt lonely or bad or depressed. I spent a lot of time worrying and fussing over her, but it wasn't enough. She deserved more. She deserves a lot, he thought. So he's recognizing the value of this person that he was married to and the kind of other person that she deserves to get to spend her life with. So that's a very important motivating theme for this character. We also see another plot or theme coming up in terms of the criminal actions, the illegalities, and being perhaps punished for them. So Wyndham Matson, who Frink and his partner Ed are going to blackmail, and Childen, who is going to be part of this blackmail scheme, the antiquities dealer, they end up turning Frank in. So Wyndham Matson has the police look into him, and Frank goes in and pretends to be an admiral's gentleman. This gets the whole ball rolling with the possibility of all these pistols and other memorabilia, Americana, being fakes. And in time, the investigation goes on, and Frank, in fact, will be arrested by the police. So this is in chapter 12, and we see this. Here we go. An ordinary, middle-aged white man sauntered up to him. Mr. Frink, you got it, Frink said. The man produced a folded document and identification. I'm with the San Francisco Police Department. I have a warrant for your arrest. What for? Frank demanded. Bunko. Mr. Childen, American Artistic Handcrafts. The cop forcibly led Frink along the sidewalk. Another plainclothes cop joined them, one now on either side of Frink. They hustled him towards a parked, unmarked Toyota Pet. And Frink thinks, that's what the time requires of us. And the cops say, do you have an attorney? And they talk about, what they're going to do and what he did with the money. And then we get to the real turning point. As they got out of the car, one of them said to Frink, is your real name Fink? Frink felt terror. Fink, the cop repeated. You're a kike. He exhibited a large gray folder. Refugee from Europe. I was born in New York, Frink said. You're an escapee from the Nazis, the cop said. You know what this means. Frink broke away and ran across the garage. The three cops shouted. At the doorway, he found himself facing a police car with uniformed armed police blocking his path. The police smiled at him, and one of them, holding a gun, stepped out and smacked a handcuff in place over his wrist. Jerking him by the wrist, the cop led him back the way he'd come. Back to Germany, one of the cops said, surveying him. I'm an American, Frink said. You're a Jew, the cop said. As he was taken upstairs, one of the cops said, "Will he be booked here?" "No," another said. "Well, hold him for the German consul. They'll want to try him under German law." So this looks like a complete catastrophe at this point. But what we're going to find out is that Tagomi is going to inadvertently save Frink, not knowing who he is, but wanting to take some sort of revenge or retaliate against the German authorities for their attack on the Nippon Times complex, which necessitated Tagomi killing 2 SD agents and then having to go through this incredible reintegration experience. So we'll talk about what happens after that, but we should now talk about the jewelry itself. So there's this very interesting early part discussing this, where Frank has gone back, hasn't had any success with Wyndham Matson, and then he's talking with Ed McCarthy, who says, "You should go into business for yourself." And they go back and forth about this, and McCarthy says we should do jewelry, and he suggests that they should create a new market, take it into retail shops. And then they get to the heart of this. McCarthy says, "How long since you tried to do original designing, real creative work?" And Frink says, "Years. I can copy accurately as hell." So he's great at generating fakes. That's been his trade for the last 15 years. But then McCarthy says something. McCarthy believes in Frink more than he himself does. So he says, "You know what I think? I think you've picked up the Nazi ideas that Jews can't create. They can only imitate and sell, middlemen." And he says, "Try it. Do some original designs or work directly on the metal. Play around like a kid plays." And Frink says, "No." And then McCarthy says, "You've no faith. You've completely lost faith in yourself, right? It's too bad, because I know you could do it." And he does do it. And the success is on a very interesting level. They take the jewelry in, and Childen is going to take it on consignment, and Childen will end up giving some pieces to people who can recognize their genuine value and who can be very affected by it. So what do we find here? Before that happens, and just about the time that he's going to be arrested, Frank gets discouraged. He's like, "We haven't sold any of this. We've been to 5 shops already. We're just building more and more jewelry. You've got to buy me out, Ed." And Ed's like, "Well, what are we going to do? Split the motor down the middle?" And this doesn't get resolved because Frank gets arrested immediately after that. But what's happening in the meantime without Frank knowing anything about it? His jewelry has captured or possesses this transcendental value, this incredibly important quality of Wu. And we find this out because Robert Childen has given one of Frank's pieces to Paul. Paul comes back and says, "I have inspected this piece for several days. For no logical reason, I feel a certain emotional fondness. It doesn't have wabi, nor could it ever. But, Robert, this object has Wu. The hands of the artificer had Wu and allowed that Wu to flow into this piece. Possibly he himself knows only that this piece satisfies. It is complete, Robert. By contemplating it, we gain more Wu ourselves. We experience the tranquility associated not with art, but holy things." He goes on to say to have no historicity, no artistic aesthetic worth, and yet to partake of some ethereal value. That is a marvel. Just precisely because this is a miserable, small, worthless-looking blob, that contributes to its possessing woo. And he goes on and he says, in a lot of cases, the woo is within the viewer. It's a religious experience. Here, an artificer, Frink, has put woo into the object rather than witness the woo inherent in it. He says, an entire new world is pointed to by this. The name for it is neither art, for it has no form, nor religion. What is it? It is an authentically new thing on the face of the world. So, Frink not only is still creative, he is able to create in a way that can be recognized by others. And this is what makes Tagomi's life-changing, reintegrating experience of an alternate reality possible, which, interestingly, not only helps to heal Tagomi, but prepares the way for Tagomi to intervene to save Frink. Both of them doing things that affect each other without ever encountering each other. And we end with chapter 14. Frink is released. That evening, just after the dinner meal, a police officer came to Frank's cell, unlocked the door, and told him to go pick up his possessions at the desk. Arrested for no real reason, he thought, no purpose, and then they let me go the same way. And he thinks to himself, a miracle that they let me go, a fluke of some kind. By rights, I should be on a plane heading for Germany for extermination. And he thinks to himself, well, this is a new life. This is a second chance, like being reborn. And then he says, like hell is being reborn. Who do I think? Pray maybe? Pray to what? I wish I understood. I want to comprehend. I have to. But he knew he never would. Just be glad, he thought, and keep moving. And so what does he do? He goes back to their workshop and he meets up with Ed. And he says, you know, I've reconsidered, you know, what I was going to do. Let's start back up again. Ed says, I had the impression you were dead. Good to see you back. He banged Frink twice on the back, then returned to his sandwich. And then Frink begins working again. And he's thinking to himself, you know, I will pick up where I left off, making the jewelry, using my hands, working and not thinking, not looking up or trying to understand. I must keep busy. I must turn the pieces out. And this is where we leave off with the saga of this character, Frink. So absolutely central to this novel. And we learn so much about him along the way, about the kind of person that he is, and we might even say what his destiny is going to be.